Welcome. If you're listening, you want to get smart on the big picture fast. And today, we're diving into some really interesting analysis from Morgan Stanley.
That's right. They're looking at this intersection of, well, a potential trade war, maybe a recession, and how AI's massive energy needs fit into that puzzle.
Exactly. It's not immediately obvious how those connect. So, our mission today is basically to unpack what Morgan Stanley thinks links trade policy, the economy, and all this power AI is going to need.
Right. We're looking at their core argument and, what it might mean for energy investments.
Okay, let's get straight to it then. Their main point seems to be that electricity demand, it's going to hold up, even if a trade war hits and we slide into a recession. Why do they think that?
Well, there are really two key reasons they highlight. First is what they call the inelasticity of data center demand.
Inelasticity, meaning demand doesn't change much even if the economy does.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. We all use cloud services, streaming, online, everything. That doesn't just stop in a downturn. Plus, AI is layered on top of that now, needing constant processing power.
Okay, so that's one pillar. What's the second?
The second is manufacturing reshoring. Now, they admit a trade war could cause a short-term dip in industrial activity, but they see a longer-term trend where manufacturing might actually come back to the U.S.
Which down the line means more factories needing more power.
Precisely.
Okay.
So maybe a near-term wobble, but potentially a long-term boost. It paints this picture of resilience.
So the data centers provide a high floor and maybe manufacturing adds to the ceiling later on. And this baseline strength, this is why energy stocks have been looked at favorably, right? This bullish power demand idea.
Absolutely. That underlying expectation of solid, even growing demand makes the sector attractive. And then Morgan Stanley throws in these AI projections, and it gets, well, even more interesting.
Yeah, let's talk about those AI numbers because they are pretty staggering. They're forecasting a tenfold increase in electricity consumption just from AI by 2028.
It's a huge number, and they project that could be something like 8% of total U.S. power demand.
8% just from AI. Wow. What's driving that kind of explosive growth?
It really comes down to the hardware. As AI models get more complex, they need more powerful chips, especially GPUs, graphics processing units. They're just incredibly power hungry compared to, say, standard CPUs.
And who's buying all these power-hungry GPUs?
The big names, the hyperscalers. Morgan Stanley points directly at Meta, Amazon, Alphabet. They run the massive data centers. They're all pushing hard on AI development, and that requires, well, vast amounts of energy.
So it's an AI arms race fueled by electricity, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring back the trade war aspect. Morgan Stanley calls it uncharted waters. How does that uncertainty play into things?
Right, that's the wild card. While they're bullish long-term on demand, they do acknowledge that sudden policy shifts on trade could cause what they call a near-term shock in demand.
A shock, meaning?
Could mean companies getting nervous, maybe slowing down orders, delaying investments because they just don't know what tariffs or barriers might pop up next. So a temporary slowdown is definitely possible.
Okay, so a potential bump in the road, but they think the underlying trend driven by data centers and AI is strong enough to push through.
That seems to be the core argument, and they back this up a bit with history. They looked at past recessions.
Oh yeah, what did they find there?
Well, interestingly, since 1960, power demand during recessions has actually only fallen by an average of 0.2%. Very limited.
0.2%. That's surprisingly stable.
It is. The big outlier was obviously 2008, the global financial crisis.
Right.
Demand fell 4.2% then. But barring something that extreme, history suggests power demand holds up pretty well.
Okay, that historical context is pretty compelling. So, given this view resilient demand, booming AI needs, where does Morgan Stanley suggest investors might look in the energy sector? They mention utilities being favorable.
Yeah, utilities are often seen as, defensive plays in a recession.
Because we all still need to keep the lights on, regardless of the economy.
Pretty much. Electricity is essential. So their revenues tend to be more stable than companies in other sectors. That makes them seem safer when things get uncertain.
And they named specific ones.
They did. They highlighted Consolidated Edison, Southern Company, Duke Energy, and NextEra Energy as looking well-positioned.
And utilities have actually done pretty well this year compared to the broader market, haven't they?
Yeah, the sectors outperformed the S&P 500 quite nicely. I think up around 12% year-to-date when the analysis came out.
So beyond those traditional utilities, Morgan Stanley also seems to prefer companies that supply the utility sector rather than, say, residential solar companies.
That's an interesting distinction they make.
Yeah.
They seem more bullish on companies exposed to the large-scale needs of utilities and the energy transition.
Who falls into that category according to them?
Their top picks there were First Solar, Shoals Technologies Group, this infrastructure for solar GE Vernova, making gas turbines, and Bloom Energy, which does fuel cells.
Okay, but looking at those specific stocks, First Solar, Shoals, Bloom, they've actually been down quite a bit this year, haven't they? How does that square with the positive outlook?
That's a fair point. It highlights the difference between, a long-term thesis and short-term market performance. While Morgan Stanley likes the fundamental story, renewables, infrastructure, grid needs, these specific stocks can face headwinds.
Like what? Supply chains, policy changes?
There be any of those, maybe issues with specific projects, interest rate concerns affecting financing for renewables, changing subsidies, or just broader market sentiment hitting those growth-oriented names harder sometimes. The long-term potential might be there, but the ride isn't always smooth.
Right. Okay, what about the other side of the coin? The independent power producers, the IPPs, like Talon and Vistra, they see those as riskier in a recession.
Generally, yes. Unlike the regulated utilities with fairly predictable rates, IPPs sell power on the wholesale market.
So their prices and profits can swing a lot more with economic ups and downs.
Exactly. They're more exposed to fluctuations in electricity prices and overall demand. So a recession could hit them harder.
But Morgan Stanley still rates them as buys.
They do, interestingly. They have a buy equivalent rating on both Talon and Vistra. And the key reason seems to be the potential for massive deals with data centers.
Ah, back to the data centers. So the hope is that these IPPs can lock in huge contracts to supply power directly to those energy-hungry AI facilities.
That seems to be the thinking. If they land those big contracts, it could provide a significant, stable revenue stream, potentially offsetting some of that typical recessionary risk for an IPP.
So it's kind of a higher risk, higher reward situation for them compared to the regulated utilities. They're betting on those data center deals coming through.
You could put it that way. And you see some of that reflected in the stocks. Vistra was down quite a bit year to date at the time of the report, while Talon was roughly flat, but both had seen, enormous gains the previous year. Tripled in value, I think.
So definitely more volatile. Okay, let's try and tie this all together. The big picture for Morgan Stanley is potential trade war, possible recession, could cause some short-term static.
But the fundamental demand for electricity looks strong, largely thanks to data centers and this AI explosion that just keeps needing more power.
Right. And that leads them to favor, generally, the stability of utilities and the companies supporting their build-out, while seeing ITPs as having potential, but maybe more dependent on landing those big data center deals.
That sums it up pretty well. The core message is resilience, driven by these powerful technological and structural trends in energy consumption.
It really does show how tangled these things are: trade, tech, energy. So thinking beyond just the power grid, if AI's growth is this powerful engine potentially weathering even economic storms, what other, maybe less obvious sectors could feel significant ripple effects from AI's continued expansion? It's got to be more than just electricity demand, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question to ponder. The impacts are likely to be incredibly far-reaching.